and welcome to the Heroic Review, the show where we, the cast of the Heroic Tales, discuss fanfiction, episodes, and other delightfully ponylicious things. My name's Deadlyreg, I play the amazing character Mr. Waddle, and I'm the moderator for this discussion. Joining me is my panel of pony experts. We have BrainedbySaucepans.
Hello there.
And who do you play, BrainedbySaucepans?
I am the narrator. It is my voice to say things in as mellifluous tones as possible, which is a task I thoroughly relish.
Marvellous. We have Goombasa once again. Say hello, Goombasa.
Greetings, lovely people.
And you are in the show?
I play Razor the Crystal Pony and also Sir not appearing in episode 2.
Marvellous. We have the returnee Greg. Say hello, Greg.
Hello all.
And who do you play in the play, Greg?
Well, the not yet very important Shadowclaw.
And we have returning Cider Barrel. Hello, Cider Barrel.
Hello.
And who do you play, Cider Barrel?
I am playing Bertram Buzz in episode 3.
And we have once more the lovely Scribbler. Hello, Scribbler.
Hello.
And who do you play in the Heroic Tales, Scribbler?
I play Honey.
She also writes the damn things.
And she also writes them. Alright, this time we're looking at the fanfic Head in the Clouds by Timaeus. As the fic selector this time, Goombasa has the honour of introducing this fic. Goombasa, if you would.
After a dispute between Twilight and Rainbow Dash about the latest Daring Do novel, Rainbow struggles to make Twilight see things her way. Yet no matter what she tries, Twilight is adamant that what Rainbow believes is unrealistic and could never happen. However, a day of baking shenanigans and a night at Twilight's soon make Rainbow question how she feels towards her friend. Could there be something more than friendship between these two?
This fic is tagged romance and slice of life. So what does everybody think of those tags and the story in general? Goombasa, as our fic selector this time, would you like to go first with your opinion?
Certainly. I enjoyed the fic, obviously. I suggested that we read it. It's very cute, it's very fluffy, and it does have some nice meta in it with the ideas behind shipping, which is one of the reasons why I chose it. It's certainly not as heavy as the last few fics that we've been talking about, which is one of the reasons why I thought it would be a nice change-up.
BrainedbySaucepans, your thoughts?
Yes, I did not particularly care for this fic. I do see why people would like it, but it's not for me, and I've got some massive, massive problems with the structure, particularly the beginning as well. We'll get into that later.
Greg, do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's certainly not as dark as the previous fic, but I think it might be a little too light and fluffy for my taste.
Cider Barrel?
I personally agree with Saucy. It may have been romantic, but the structure was a bit cliche in it. It was a bit boring, if you were.
Scribbler, your thoughts?
I was bored.
Thank you, Scribbler. For my money, I thought it was good. I didn't dislike it. If I was a TwiDash shipper, I imagine it would have been right up my alley. But I'm not. Rara Jack for life. So there wasn't anything that I was coming to the story wanting. So it didn't have a niche already to occupy. So it was light, it was fluffy, it was quite cute, but I think it was a little too cute for me. So this fic, as it states in the description, was the result of a TwiDash abandoned fic. So this fic was based on 1,600 words of prompt, which takes up about half of the first chapter, which was provided to the writer, and then the rest is all Timaeus' stuff. So how do we think that influenced the structure of the fic, and what are our opinions on the differences between the two?
It definitely shows. There's a sort of massive grinding to the halt that happens halfway through when the prompt ends and Timaeus' section begins. I think that just reflects to Timaeus. It's going to sound horrible. I don't think he really knew what to do with the way it sort of left off, because when I read it before without being told where the abandoned fic ended and Timaeus' section began, yeah, that's exactly where I'd have guessed it. The change happened.
I do agree that it was pretty noticeable where the prompt ends and the actual story begins, but I honestly didn't find it too grinding to a halt, personally. I thought that the biggest change was between chapters 1 and 2, honestly, but I didn't really see that big of a change between where the prompt ends and the Timaeus' stuff began.
Honestly, about the same as everyone else. There's definitely a noticeable shift after the prompt ends And I think it does get a bit slow. Okay, extremely slow.
I didn't really get into the fic itself until about chapter 2. The first chapter altogether was boring. I didn't really get into it at all. The first storyline between Daring Do, the only thing I caught was I think it's Silverhind or Silverhand.
Manhattan's silver.
Yeah, I got that bit, and then that was pretty much it. Obviously, I understood that was the tagline to go within the story, but that's all I could get.
I remember reading this piecemeal while at work, in between different things, and I skimmed a lot of it to begin with and then went back and reread. And to be perfectly honest, I skim-read at least half of it the first time, and I got exactly the same amount of plot when I read it properly. It's not a good sign for a fic that you can miss half of it and yet miss nothing. And I'm talking from the perspective of, I think I've said this multiple times, I've been in fandom a long time and I've been reading fanfiction a long time, and when I first started, I was such an unbelievable shipper and I read everything to do with the couples that I liked. And I can imagine if I had been that age now, this would have appealed to me so much, but being who I am now, I was so bored!
I feel part of the weakness in the early half of the story. I read a few of the other fics that got the same writing prompt, and they all end with Spike coming in, and the scene with the in the bakery is really unnecessary. In all honesty,
we're going to get into that, though, aren't we?
Yes, we are going to get into that. The thing I would say at this stage is when I was first reading this, I accidentally skipped to chapter 2, and I thought, well, I'll read the first half of chapter 2 because I was at work and I didn't have a chance to go back. It was easier just to read it. So I read the first half of chapter 2. I thought, oh, that's quite clever. Because at the time, I thought it was a noodle incident situation where they were referring to a situation that had happened off camera. And Timaeus was going into a bit of depth with what had happened in this scenario with the bakery that we've never seen. I thought, oh, that's quite good. And then skipping back to chapter 1, it's all there. And it first felt that the bakery scene was a little irrelevant because everything that was achieved there was re-achieved in the start of chapter 2. Going back to something Saucy said earlier, it felt as though the Spike coming in, Timaeus didn't know exactly what to do and spent the last half of that chapter 1 and the early half of chapter 2 wrestling the story into something he could go with. I feel that the prompt harmed what could have been a better, lighter story. Moving on from that brief chat, if we could briefly discuss Twilight, Rainbow Dash, and their romance. Any thoughts or opinions there?
Other than the main point, which is the whole sort of shipping bit, the two characters didn't seem to be written massively out of character, but then again, that could be because they weren't written with any real sort of character at all. Other than a couple of sort of notable points, but the rest of it just seemed sort of, you could have fit any two characters into those roles for the vast majority of it.
Well, it's difficult for me to really say what I thought about the romance because I'm not normally into TwiDash for reasons that we'll get onto when we discuss romance tropes and whatnot. But here, I actually found it kind of believable. And like Saucy said, they weren't massively out of character. I could easily identify them as Twilight and as Rainbow Dash. I do think that there was character there. I just don't think that Timaeus used them the way that the show would have. He didn't really exemplify like Rainbow Dash's athleticism that much or Twilight's neuroses like the show would have if they were to, God forbid, follow a story like this.
Yeah, I just have to sort of agree with what's been said. I don't think they were written terribly out of character because everyone said that about 4 times now. But I believe that it was that's how Twilight at least would react to the situation. So
I am personally a big fan of shipping fics. I've read a lot of them over the past. I have 1 or 2 favorite shippings, one being Apple Dash. Please don't cringe at that. But to bring some points forward, I liked when they brought towards preening. Because that, if you've read 1 or 2, you would know that preening is quite a romantic or intimate moment between the two ponies, as it is.
In the commonly accepted fanon, at least.
Yeah,
In the
say
fandom,
accepted
yes.
fanon rather than canon. I don't think we've even seen preening at all in canon.
They've never done it.
No, all Canon gave us was the wing boner.
Canon did not give us the wing boner.
I will agree that I personally see preening as being an intimate act, being something that makes sense to me, and it's in my headcanon as well. So yeah.
Twilight and Rainbow Dash's portrayal. Well, couple of things basically. I think Rainbow Dash did come off as Rainbow Dash, but she came off very much as immediately post Read It and Weep Rainbow Dash. So she didn't have all that much characterization to go off, I feel, at that point, that hadn't already been reiterated multiple times in canon. Because the first 2 seasons, a lot of the ponies can sort of be accused of learning the same lesson over and over again. And that was the first time she learned something new, which was that reading is not a bad thing and that it's not bad to look like a nerd, which, personally, from my viewpoint, is an excellent lesson to learn. However, I think that her characterization is very, very bare bones. Twilight, kind of the same thing, with one glaring difference. I think Rainbow Dash very much did fit her canon archetype, rather than her nuanced character from canon. Twilight kind of fit the canon archetype as well. She has that spaz out moment where she's worrying about the date. She has a relatively logical discussion about the story itself and about Daring Do and Manhattan Silver and all the different things. But the major thing that I felt was wrong, and I see this in a lot of shipping fiction, which is when one character clearly fancies the other one and neither of them quite realise it. Now, in Rainbow Dash's perspective, I can understand that, because looking at May the Pest Pet Win, she is not the brightest diamond in the box. However, I don't think I can forgive this bit about Twilight that she wouldn't get what was going on. Yes, she's a little bit socially truncated. Yes, she's a little bit emotionally stunted. But the way that Rainbow Dash kept going on about things, it was so heavily flagged that somebody of Twilight's reputed intelligence and her reading ability, the fact that she has read so much, there's no way she would miss it, even if Rainbow Dash herself had not cottoned on. So the fact that she was the one who didn't get it and had to have it spelled out to her by Rainbow Dash struck me as incredibly out of character.
Well, Twilight is learning lessons about friendship, not about love.
She's read a lot of romance books.
Well, as we see in the fic, she consults those romance books for
So
ideas.
in which case there's definitely no forgiving of it, because she should know, she should be able to see this in reality. Rainbow Dash is forgivable. She's not read much before, and as I said, she is not the fastest snail on the track. But Twilight, no.
As you mentioned, that's what the fan version of Twilight does. She just refers to a book. That's pretty much all I can say about that.
Characterization was quite light.
For MLP, they're character archetypes rather than characters. There's something that, when I talk about writing in writing classes, I always talk about characters versus ciphers. And that's the idea that a character is a well-rounded creation. It has hopes, it has dreams, it has a personality. It isn't necessarily perfect, doesn't always make the best choices, but is believable. A cipher is a name on the page doing stuff. And I got the feeling that through a lot of this that they were names on a page doing stuff, just like Saucy said earlier.
We might do a full episode on this later, but there's a certain amount of ticky box characterization that you see in a lot of fanfic, where there are certain character beats that have been briefly touched on in the show, and to recharacterize someone like Rainbow Dash, they just use the beat again. For clarity, this fic was written 13th of July 2013, which puts it after the Season 3 finale, just if that influences anyone's opinions on how the characters were formed. So, Rainbow Dash likes the book, Rainbow Dash is hot-headed but clueless, Twilight Sparkle reads a book. These are all shorthand for quickly establishing the character by just reminding us of a thing that happened in the show. When we look back to March, at the very least, there was new characterization coming in. It was for Chrysalis, but there was new characterization coming in, and there was new beats that Foxy Kimchi was putting in and then referring back to later. And a similar thing could be said for our very first fic, Biblical Monsters, where there was a bit of variation. It wasn't just recreating the character that we've seen. And that seems to be a fault in this and many other fics, is a lack of any kind of novelty to the characters. Okay, that's our general opinions of the fic. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this thing. So the first thing we'd like to talk about, viewing this fic, is in the very first chapter, we go from the story writing prompt straight to Timaeus's writing, and Timaeus decides to give Spike's message, and in the latter half of the chapter is a farcical situation happening at Sugar Cube Corner. So we have farce happening as sort of the very first novel thing that Timaeus has put into the story. Do we have any opinions? Saucy?
Oh, yes, we have opinions here. You mentioned earlier the sort of box-ticking characterization, and this seemed like the mandatory comedy section of the fic. And it just does not work for so many reasons. The first of which is the first rule of writing: show, don't tell. And here we have a wonderful little example of it, in that we've got Spike coming in, and he explains what's been going on. And he says, oh, Scootaloo's attached to the ceiling, Pinkie Pie's tried to pry her off with a spatula, Apple Bloom and Sweetie Belle are caught in a blender. And it's telling us rather than showing us. And then we get to the scene, and it describes the exact same thing again. And it's just, why? Why the fuck was that necessary?
I think it's maybe because of that show don't tell thing that you mentioned, that maybe the author thought halfway through, oh crap, I'm supposed to show this, not tell it, but forgot to take out, or thought if they would leave in the tell part as well. Cover all bases, maybe.
That's sort of my impression as well with it.
It gives the impression of a very young writer. I don't know anything about Timaeus, but the writing style is very young.
Definitely. Another thing, it's entirely unrelated to the rest of the fic. What happens in there that's relevant to the rest of the fic?
It's just a subplot.
You can't say it's just a subplot, because
Subplot has to go somewhere!
a subplot has to tie in with the rest of the thing. It's got to have some sort of link, whether it's thematic or it's got some sort of connection. In this, one thing happens that's relevant to the rest of the fic, and that's them getting covered in cake batter. That's all we need to know. And someone said earlier that it would have worked so much better as just a noodle incident, i.e. something that the details aren't alluded to, but what details we hear just make us think, what the f*** happened? That sounds hilarious. Because your mind fills in the details, and it's always funnier when you're trying to sort of piece together details from less information. Or rather, it's always funnier if you know how to write comedy, and I'm afraid Timaeus doesn't know how to write comedy going by this.
Or at least physical comedy.
Oh, definitely. I'm a big fan of farce myself, as people may have gathered from the review of episode 3 of season 4. Part of that comes from reading a lot of books by a wonderful, sadly deceased gentleman known as Tom Sharp. And if you want to know how to write farce, study the man's work, because the man was a genius.
We'll put a link to Tom Sharp in the show notes for people to want to check him out.
I get the feeling that Timaeus is trying to take visual farce and describe it, and it will have the same effect. And one thing that I've noticed in a lot of professional fiction and fan fiction and everything besides, visual farce does not translate well to the written word. You have to treat farce in a different way if you're going to write it. As Saucy said, it was a logical progression of events, that none of it was slapstick humour, because slapstick doesn't work when it's written. It has to be seen to have the right impact. And that's why the show itself works so well. We can see what's happening. That scene in Castlemania where all the ponies are running around having a complete meltdown would not work if it was just written down. You had to see the chaos for it to have the right emotional impact and dramatic impact. But in a fic, when you describe that same kind of scene, which is what Timaeus has done here, it's like he's seen in his head what was happening in this fictional episode that he's writing. And just describing that does not make us laugh. To take, for example, if we say the scene in which Pinkie Pie is hitting the bell with her head in Castlemania. If I say Pinkie Pie hits a bell with her head, it doesn't have that innate humour to it. But if you see the way she was hitting the bell with her head, you automatically smile and giggle a little. It doesn't work sometimes to write about something that should be seen.
Yeah, I got to agree with what Scribbler was saying about the inability to convey this particular sort of humor in that one scene as writing. Maybe the incidents leading up to that would have been funny if we'd seen them happen, but we didn't. The end result was just not funny.
As I say, the point I was trying to make earlier was that one good way of getting fast to work in the written media is you've got to see inside the characters' heads and actually understand how this logical progression happens, and yet simultaneously we will be aware of the absurdity of it.
Yes, yes.
That's a bloody good rule for farce. As I say, it's not the only way of doing it, but it's a good starting point.
I think you've just articulated what I was trying to say very inarticulately. The idea of you can't just show what's happening. And the thing I missed out that you, thankfully, nailed on the head was, yes, you've got to see the character's motivations inside their head. Otherwise, it is just telling and not showing, even though you are showing something.
I think a popular writer who doesn't do farce, but who can convey this, Douglas Adams can convey absurdity very well.
Oh, definitely.
The thing with farce is, if we compare it back to what we were saying in a previous Heroic review with Castlemania, you've got to have that Jenga tower, and when it comes tumbling down, that's when the humour hits. But building the Jenga tower in literature is more difficult than visual. You've got to do it through language use. You've got to do it through the way you convey it. With sort of the manner in which most fanfic is written, and with a lot of fiction is written, is you have the describe what the character does, then say what the character says. And that can carry a lot of stories. But if you're looking at something like farce, it's a lot more difficult. So it becomes a nuts and bolts issue of how your story is constructed. You're not just taking these Jenga blocks and building the tower. You have to build each individual Jenga block through the way that you are conveying what is happening. And then you can let the tower fall over. What we have is an extended sequence of wouldn't it be funny if... And wouldn't it be funny if is very rarely funny because you are over-explaining the situation. Timaeus is describing every individual thing that is happening. There's nothing left to the imagination, and that makes the whole thing fall flat.
And once again, this section takes up 10% of the total length of the fic. This is not just a small throwaway bit. This is a large section of the fic.
Yes, overall achieves nothing. It doesn't influence what happens later. What we've come to this fic for as an audience is this resolution of feelings between Twilight and Rainbow Dash. This doesn't influence any of that. It's never mentioned again. All we get is mentioning something that we would have seen if this was a real episode, which is the Cutie Mark Crusaders do something wacky, these two characters intervene. If it was an episode, this would take a minute, probably less. This is probably 30 seconds. But because he's explaining the joke, it takes far longer than it needs to.
If people are going to experience farce, they shouldn't start with this fic. If you're going to start with farce in fanfiction, read Applejack is Full of Squirrels.
Or seek out Tom Sharp.
I was just talking fanfic. The wider world is full of farce that's better than this, but in fanfic, it's a bit limited.
So, having discussed farce, we'll get down to the meat. So, romance in fiction and the romance at the heart of it. This is essentially a shipping fic, which means it's dealing with romance between two characters from an established property, as this is fanfiction. Fiction and fanfiction have their tropes and cliches that they use very commonly, partially because they're well known by audiences and partially because it's quick and easy. Scribbler, could you explain what a trope is for our listening audience?
Well, if everyone knows what a cliché is, it's a single thing that is used over and over again in fiction, like you said, as a shorthand for something, or just because it's a very popular thing. A trope is a pattern of clichés, so it's got to be one thing, but there's a pattern of them in a sequence. So, for example, you've got the idea of a hero has a square jaw, that's a cliché. A hero has a square jaw, doesn't say much, and rescues the damsel, that's a trope, because it's a pattern of clichés.
So, what tropes do we see in this particular fic? We've got shipping.
The characters are too thick to know that they're in love.
Idiot ball.
Idiot ball. We have characters who should know better but don't. Even the opening section has plenty of tropes being brought up, so that's probably a good place to start looking. We have Daring Do sharing a kiss with the square-jawed hero. Had she just rescued him? Had he just rescued her?
I think he just rescued her, which kind of undercut everything Lauren Faust ever tried to do.
Yeah. There was the damsel in distress. We have the square-jawed Manhattan Silver, who's the proud,
very masculine stallion.
Yeah.
Who, of course, Daring Do is completely reliant upon for approval, and the slightest thought that he doesn't approve her actions, she's completely falls to pieces.
That's true.
Progress.
They have a very unromantic kiss. The unromantic kiss is a trope that I really wish would go away. The unromantic kiss is something that is described with verbs that are not romantic. And it's the idea of their lips mashed together. And I think I talked about this in the previous review. Mashing is not a romantic verb. If lips mash, you have crashed into someone.
I believe the words they actually use are furiously collided, which, if anything, sounds even worse than mashed, so...
That sounds like a headbutt. The thing is, it's not singular to this fic. That happens in a lot of romantic fiction in and out of fandom.
This is not Timaeus' words, though. These are the words of the story prompt.
Timaeus did have the chance to change it, but whoever wrote this original bit, it's another word that I read. I can hold my hand up and say I read a lot of romantic fiction. It kind of goes in my reading list because I read, on average, something like 400 or 500 books a year, and I get a lot of young adult fiction and things like that on my reading list, and I see the same tropes over and over again. And because I get a lot of young adult fiction, I see a lot of these tropes distilled because they have to be distilled in order to apparently appeal to people with a shorter attention span. Why? I don't know. But I see this over and over again of describing romance in a way that makes it sound almost primal. Works in some instances, but not in others. And whatever instance it is, it's not romantic. And if the tone the author is going for is sudden romance, the crescendo in the background, the fiery backdrop, the gone with the wind, I don't give a damn moment, it doesn't work if you're going to use a word like collided. It doesn't work if you say they are furiously. Furious means angrily. And I don't understand why it would suddenly be meaning heated, because that's not what it means.
I think this is going to people not understanding the language they are using, which is more common in every single part of fiction than people either realize or would like to admit.
But that's the trope, is these phrases that keep getting used over and over again. And like you said, people don't understand exactly what they're saying, but they use it because they've seen it over and over.
I'm going to go a little off topic. There's somebody, and I'm not sure who it was, I may put a link in the show notes, made an excellent comparison with the Marvel film The Avengers, which I assume at least half of the people here have seen. There is one line which is absolutely marvellous, where the character of Loki turns to the Samuel L. Jackson character and says, "How desperate are you that you've turned to these oddballs to save the day?" And the response is pretty much, "You have made me very desperate." And what you've got there is something rather lovely, where you have the line, "How desperate are you?" which is being used because it's a very commonly used sort of insult. How desperate are you? Demeaning the choice that person's made. Whereas the second character is turning around and using it to imply that they are desperate. And when you do that, you're showing that people who are desperate make choices that may not be good, but they are not going to be good for anybody. A desperate person makes very dangerous choices. And it's a line that I think shows that if you know the language you are using, it's not necessarily easy, but it's possible to make some quite clever double meanings that can impart a lot into the text beyond just the words that you have chosen to use. With tropes, especially, when you use something, if you're using it because you've seen it used, it conveys a different meaning to because you've carefully chosen those words because they show something in particular. And this isn't a slight against Timaeus, because this is obviously created by somebody else, but if you are just using words because they are the words that you expect to see in fiction, and particularly in romance, then they aren't going to be as powerful in conveying something like romance or farce as if you'd set out to use that word because it perfectly matches the intent that you wanted to convey.
It's like getting a Mills and Boon romance. It's the same thing over and over again. That's why there's over 300,000 Mills and Boon titles.
I don't know if this fits this part of the discussion, but in regards to Twilight's rather unrealistic inability to see that Rainbow Dash is having these feelings, it might, in a way, tie into her obsession with books, just to rescue perhaps a bit of the characterization, that she might see it and write it off as impossible because it seems so very cliche, which then kind of ties in with tropes.
No, that is a good point
That's
to make.
a good point, yeah.
There is a meta-commentary all through the fic that Twilight is saying these kinds of things don't happen in real life. This is something we are going to heavily touch upon later.
Oh, yes.
There is a discussion that these things don't happen in real life. Of course, they're not happening to us, which that is a point that we should have considered, which, as you said, is the driving reason that Twilight can't accept this idea, because it seems like something out of a... And while that can be used lazily, I think that actually is used very well here. Let's briefly talk about, though, how their romance ends with a passionate kiss at the top of a Ferris wheel during a sunset while there are fireworks.
Can I just have my really intelligent comment on this?
Yeah? Thank you very much,
I
Scribbler.
second that. Oh, God!
It did end in the most cliched, most tropey manner possible, which is they confess their love to each other in dramatic, romantic circumstances. There weren't fireworks. It was just they embraced each other as the last light of the sun dips below the horizon.
So they managed to avoid one romantic scene cliche.
The problem with tropes is that they're kind of snacks in a way. You can very easily build around them and do something more. You can use them as prompts. You can use them as...
They're tools.
They're tools, thank you.
But they are blunt tools that have been used a lot by someone else.
They are tools that you use to prop up something else. It's so you don't... It's almost like muscle memory for stories. So you put in a guy with a square jaw, people will assume he's a hero. In this fic, the issue is that they are used as an endpoint when really they are intended as a tool to get you quickly to a different point. So we have the sunset kiss. We have the characters unable to realize their feelings for one another. But the problem that I feel this fic has is it spends an awful lot of time establishing the trope rather than just showing the trope and using that to build on. The idea of a trope is it's a big package of information that your audience has already been taught. So you can use that trope to assume knowledge that your audience has and then move on to what you want to tell them. But what we have here is a trope, as we've said several times, is a ticky box, where the author was working towards getting this trope across to us in this particular circumstance, when really the word count that they used to get there wasn't necessary.
18,000+ words to get to a kiss on a Ferris wheel.
Yep.
That's the general tropes we'll see in romance, in fiction and fanfiction. So the specific kind of tropes we're looking at here is shipping between two established characters and how fanfiction treats that. Scribbler, as you've said on your channel several times, you've been in a lot of fandoms. Do you want to give us a general overview here?
Shipping, no matter what the fandom, in my experience, and I freely admit that this is not everybody's experience, but shipping tends to follow several established patterns, and it seems to do this very naturally whether or not people are aware that they are following the same pattern as multiple fandoms before and after them. And there tends to be sort of the patterns of the OTP, of the fandom bike, of the established characters that nobody will break apart. And there's a lot of permissiveness in shipping in fandom, which is why you have things like shotafic, which is why you have things like, they've renamed rape non-con, why you have things like incest fic that is socially taboo relationships, which are given equal rights to everything else in fandom. And in some ways, that is a good thing, because that's kind of how same-sex relationships are getting equal weight with every other relationship within the context of fandom. But shipping tends to, no matter what the relationship, follow certain patterns. And it does tend to be, as Deadlyreg said, these tropes that prop up shipping everywhere. From country to country, from fandom to fandom, from story to story, it's always these same tropes over and over and over again. And I'd like to hear other people's opinions on what they think these tropes are, specific just to shipping in fandom, as opposed to romance in general.
Well, I think the big one is opposites attract. From what little experience I have in reading this sort of fic, which is probably significantly more than I'd care to admit, but it does seem that the big thing is, oh, these two are nothing like each other. They must secretly be in love. That does seem to be the one thing that every fandom that I've seen seems to home in on and just sort of tear apart with rabid shipping.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that one entirely, that the opposites attract trope is a major one in fandom. It's a major one in most fiction, but definitely in fandom. What do other people think?
Well, I know about as much as shipping as I know about quantum physics here, so the only experience I really have with a lot of fanfic is this particular fandom. And the only major trend I keep seeing is that there's a massive tendency toward making all the characters, well, gay.
That's really common, actually.
I see why, though, because of the massive imbalance between the genders in the canon characters and the general dislike of OCs.
That's only a part of it. I think the other thing you do have to sort of look at as well is the underrepresentation of non-heterosexual relationships in most media.
Yep, I would agree with that fully. And that's why, as I said, shipping in fandom, the same-sex relationship thing spans most fandoms. Admittedly, this is the first fandom I've been in where female-female relationship has been the precedent. the majority of fandoms I've seen has been male specific.
Once again, I've seen quite a few things on my Tumblr, basically just people sharing experiences of how, because of the media's focus on just pure heterosexual relationships, they didn't realise that anyone else was into the stuff they're into. So of course there's going to be sort of overcompensating by sort of flooding the market with this sort of thing, and go for it, in my opinion.
Yep, I fully agree. I love the openness of fandom on this kind of thing. And I must admit, when I first came across this kind of thing, I was at university, and that was the first time I'd come across female fiction. And it was in the Gargoyles fandom, and it was the first time I'd come across it at all. As in, I had a very sheltered upbringing, to the point where I genuinely didn't know that the word lesbian existed until I was about 17. And even then, I didn't really know what it was. But I think a lot of my world experience has come from fandom opening my eyes.
Shipping is generally, certainly from what I'd seen, it is usually homosexual relationships rather than heterosexual, because the show itself will explore those heterosexual relationships. So the homosexual relationships will largely go unacknowledged, and that's fertile breeding ground for the minds of fans. Certainly I know that the term /fic is a pre-internet term that comes from character/character.
Star Trek fanzines.
Yeah, Star Trek fanzines.
That was where I invented that one.
But in this fandom, we see a lot of female-female relationships. Now, it's certainly a trend. I don't have any solid figures to quote, I'm afraid. But manga is a good way to go, where yuri mangas, girl-girl relationships, are largely read by men, whereas male-male mangas are largely read by women.
That really does support what I was saying earlier about a lot of the fandoms I've been in before this one, like video game fandoms like Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts and things, were very much female-heavy fandoms with lots and lots of male-male shipping.
Yep. Something I'll also mention is that yaoi, male-male mangas are still being made, whereas yuri mangas aren't, because women buy things and men get it off the internet. So yuri is financially unviable. That is a little manga side note for everybody. But with this fandom, we don't actually have enough male characters to do anything of any depth, unless you really, really like Big Mac / Brayburn / Caramel,
Doctor Hooves.
Soren.
Yes, but as we go into this, a lot of those are fanon characters. When we're looking at pairings that people can approach without any pre-knowledge, certainly if you're coming from the show, really it's the main characters that you can actually do this with, because there's established characterization of them that you can draw from, which is, of course, the nut and bolts of fanfic. If you're coming into something you're wanting to have a Soren / Brayburn fic, there is almost nothing on those characters other than Soren likes pie, Brayburn is expressive. That's all we have on those characters. Everything else will be the individual ideas of the writer, which means that you have a certain level of buy-in where you have to either have read fics where the fanon is established on those two characters, or the author has to take time to establish who those characters are. And sometimes if you want to get straight down to the exploration of the relationship, it's easier to go with an established character, which is the main six. And I think that is why we see so many female-female homosexual relationships in the fanfic that come from My Little Pony. So when we're drawing from canon, we're looking at those main six. When we're looking at fanon, it gets more interesting, because Vinyl, Scratch, and Octavia don't exist. Neither do Lyra and Bonbon. Neither do Dr. Hooves and Derpy. None of these characters exist in the purview of the show that they're based on. They're all based on fanon. So all of the character traits we know about them have been created almost by a gestalt, where individual bits and pieces have come together to create these characters. Do we find there's any difference between fics where the main six are shipped to where these background characters are shipped?
There's a lot more tropes in the main six ones, especially when you've got characters that are in their infancy. So the really early Octavia Vinyl ones like Allegrezza, where there weren't any fanon tropes to draw on. That fic was one of the ones that sort of developed them from scratch. And things like Lyra and Bonbon, the whole Lyra obsessed with humans thing, that has been established over time. Bonbon being grumpy, Lyra being slightly
goofy.
I will go with your word, goofy. These things have developed over time, but if you go back to the early fanfics where there wasn't any fanon to pull on, they're very, very different in a lot of those. And a lot of those early fanfics, if they don't fit in with what became established fanon, they're not really very popular. And yet it's really interesting to think they're actually just as legitimate as anything else. It's just that fanon seems to have, as you said, with some gestalt mind, have decided that this was not right and therefore was not acceptable. Which is why Octavia now has an English accent in pretty much everything when she never even talked on film.
There is the benefit for the Vinyl Octavia relationship that Epic Wub Time came out quite early on, and that really set down a tone for the two characters. I don't know whether early fanon had really set anything for those two, but certainly that seems to heavily have influenced everything that came after.
If people want to see early Vinyl Octavia, they should go back and look at Allegrezza. It's really short. I think it's about 9 chapters long, and they're really short chapters, only a couple of thousand words each. That was the fic that put them together as a pairing very first. That was the first one that did it.
Link in the show notes.
That was one of the ones that invented the fandom tropes because there weren't any. There wasn't even a connection between them. Those two were not in the same episode, had shared no screen time, and pretty much the only thing that connected them was they both had musical-themed cutie marks.
There's a term I encountered, in this particular case, Yuri goggles, but I've later learned it's referred to generally as shipping goggles, where you take little things and say, well, they must be in love. And in this fic, we've got the milkshakes with Rosetta and Daring Do, where a lot is being inferred from nothing. Is that common in this fandom, do you think? Or do you think we've managed to dodge that particular bullet?
Oh, that is common everywhere.
Because really, the only thing we've had in this fandom has been the Rainbow Dash arm around me moment.
Yes.
Which Megan McCarthy immediately decided to troll with. But other than that...
Well, we also had Flash Sentry.
Oh,
we've had
God.
Flash Sentry, but that was...
It's not canon, though. It's not canon.
It may not be considered canon, but I'm pretty sure most people are going to consider that bit of fanon, if nothing else.
I think it's the closest
It was
we'll
there.
ever get.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
in my mind, Flash Sentry will always be gummy.
Yeah, the comic, yeah.
The particular romance trope we've got here is the idea of opposites attract. Something that Twilight comments that doesn't happen in real life. People who are so different don't ever get together. How do we find this done in fandom? Do we find that characters who are very different are often paired together, or do we tend to see more similar characters paired together?
As I said earlier, it is everywhere, isn't it? It is the one thing that every fandom seems to sort of grasp upon. If these two characters have nothing in common, then obviously
They must be in love because they're arguing.
Specifically in MLP, the opposites attract. The first that comes to mind for me is Vinyl and Octavia being opposite as far as musical taste, at least. Vinyl is usually portrayed as being like the wild party animal, and Octavia is more refined. And it is similar with Rainbow Dash being athletic and Twilight being a nerd. Those are two of the biggest opposite attract examples I can think of.
Do we think they're the most opposite of the main six?
Oh.
No, I don't think so.
I think, personally, if you want an absolute opposite, for me, it has to be Rarity and Applejack.
I think Flutterdash.
I'd say apple pie.
That's true, actually. I'll back that one.
Good point.
I changed my vote.
With this opposite attract, we have these two characters, Rosetta and Daring Do, who one is the bookish mare and the other... Well, basically, the way that they're portrayed in the fiction, we can more or less just say they are Twilight Sparkle and Rainbow Dash.
Well, Daring Do was already a recolor of Rainbow Dash in canon.
Yeah, she's a recolored puppet. But with this, the way that this Rosetta character is written, she's written to very specifically just be Twilight Sparkle, but in a book. So I don't think we need to discuss the meta relationship there.
I don't think we need to at all, but it's pretty much explicitly stated as not being a relationship at all.
Yeah.
I was promised so much meta by this fic that did not deliver.
Yeah, what we have in this little intro fic is this idea that Rainbow Dash is inferring a lot from nothing, but we don't really get any more of that later on.
That was what I was hoping for.
Which we were hoping for, yes. With Rainbow Dash and Twilight Sparkle, when we look at the two characters, they're really, really not that different. I did a little digging, looking at psychological studies into opposites attract. Now, what we have is that relationships between two people, this is all self-identified, so it has to be taken with a pinch of variable. But if you have a couple where one identifies as extrovert and one identifies as introvert, they tend to do just as well as, if not better than, relationships where both identify as extrovert or introvert. So where you have varying personality types, they tend to do just as well as similar personality types. What you have overall is breakups in relationships which, rather than being personality focused, are goal focused. So if two people have very divergent life goals, short-term or long-term, they don't last. Whereas if their likes and dislikes, their personalities are very different, but their overall goals are the same, those relationships do very well. So what you tend to find is that it's not based at all on the outward appearance or outward personality of a person so much as it is what they want. And what Twilight Sparkle and Rainbow Dash want is exactly the same thing, which is friendship.
And a kiss on a Ferris wheel.
And kissing on a Ferris wheel. That's all these characters want. I'll admit that what we have the problem with in this story is that their wants are pretty shallow. So we can't really infer anything beyond that. Their courtship finds no obstacle other than their own dismissal and doubt of their feelings for one another. That's the only problem they have. Because really what they both want is to be really good friends. And they don't really have anything they disagree over. As much as we've been told that these people are too different, as we learn from, I think that it was laid down best by Paul Abdul in her breakout psychological study Opposites Attract with MC Scatcat, that as different as you are, provided you want the same thing, there's a solid foundation for a very healthy relationship there. So really what I'm saying is that Rainbow Dash and Twilight Sparkle don't know nothing about how love works. Really, Cadence should have been in this fic.
I think that the only thing I would add is that it's archetype opposites rather than character opposites, which kind of supports what you said, that their relationship finds no problems because they're not really characters, they're ciphers.
Yeah, we have a distinct lack of overall conflict in this story. I think that's the major problem with it. I think that was our problem with it as a romance fic. There's nothing wrong with a good romance fiction, but there's no real obstacle for the lovers to overcome in this compared to even other fan fictions. The only thing that comes in the way is whether or not they acknowledge their feelings.
And the idiot ball.
We were talking about tropes earlier. The idea of them, the only conflict being them acknowledging their feelings, is very much a trope of fan fiction and shipping. A romance trope in actual fiction, in like published fiction that is acceptable in the public forum, is it's got to be the couple get together, the couple break up, the couple get back together again.
I do think I've just sort of realised why that might be so prevalent in fan fiction. It's because they've got to explain why it's not canon. Because otherwise, that's the only recourse they've got. If they want to say there's a relationship, then obviously they have to be denying it to themselves.
Yeah, it does seem to be a lot of it is fix-it fic.
You've got to explain the reason why they haven't gotten together in the actual show.
I think that he's just explained away the majority of shipping in every fandom ever.
There's also an issue we have where I'm going to suggest that a lot of fanfic for these relationships is the relationship coming together, because what happens after that is their relationship. And, I mean, someone correct me, are there many fics in this fandom about the relationship two characters have, rather than the two characters coming together?
I have a theory that it's not my theory, it was one I read many years ago, about why fanfiction tends to deal with the start of the relationship and not the midpoint in the relationship, which is kind of why I'm really glad that a pairing like Bonbon and Lyra exists, where it's just kind of accepted they're midway in a relationship and quite comfortable with each other, as opposed to starting a relationship. But the theory I read, and this was many years ago when fanfiction.net used to do editorials, and I used to read them because they were really, really interesting about the nature of fandom. And it was that a lot of fanfiction is, or was at that point, written by very young authors who don't have experience of long-term relationships. So for them, the most important part of a relationship is the inception. And therefore, the thing that they want to romanticize themselves about being perfect in a fanfiction, which is just wish fulfillment in a very basic sense, is the start where everything is nice and perfect and romantic before the problems of reality have set in. Which is why a lot of stories written by older authors who have more life experience tend to deal with midpoints in relationships or the ending of relationships and problems of real life in relationships, because that's their frame of reference.
Yeah, I think it's because the relationships themselves are most exciting when they're starting out or when there is something that really challenges that relationship. And if something is challenging that relationship, you have to establish the relationship first very quickly and then get to what is under threat. So the relationship that is stable is not very exciting to read about. So I think that you've got quite a good point there, that if it's a younger audience, they're going to want to write about a relationship starting, because you can imagine what a relationship looks like when it's starting. It's two people coming together. Whereas a relationship about people who've been together for a while is much harder to do, because you have to either have read an awful lot about the subject, or you need to have been in that position. And a lot of the people who get into fandoms, I imagine, are quite young. Certainly, I think this fandom skews into the late teens who haven't necessarily been in a long-term relationship.
What was the statistic I read on EQD, I think it was, or a journal somewhere on FimFiction, was that the general demographic for FimFiction writers is somewhere between 15 and 35.
I've just looked up the Brony study results, and age range is from 14 to 57. Average age is 21.
We can be comfortable saying that people at the age of 21, I think the demographic for Pony of the adult audience skews male. Adult males of 21 probably haven't been in stable long-term relationships. So I imagine it's hard for them to really conceptualize what could be interesting about a long-term stable relationship in and of itself. The answer is that there's not a lot to really say about it other than it's great. And then you move on and you deal with probably the threat to it, which is hard to do. It's the reason I think dark fic is so popular with My Little Pony is it's easier to write than what's threatening the candy world. What mild peril shall we get into this week? People like to have really high stakes.
That's why Fallout Equestria is so popular.
Yeah, the stakes are much higher, whereas in canon, the stakes are never really going to get that high because everything's basically fine.
I don't know about that. I think canon does have some pretty high stakes.
One thing that I'm going to ask if anyone else got this impression. Did this fic to anyone else seem very defensive in its outlook?
I felt it was approached very slowly as it was. There wasn't anything exciting in it.
That's not entirely what I mean there. What I mean is, it seems to me that the purpose of the fiction is to sort of call out people who are sort of denying the validity of non-canon relationships. It seems to be it comes across very defensively in that sort of respect. That's the impression I got. I just want to see if other people thought the same.
I get that from a lot of ship fic, to be honest. I get a lot of, especially when it's the main six, people do get very defensive because, I don't know if it's because when they put something online to do with the main six, they know that it's going to be a load of people posting going, no, my OTP is better!
OTP is the death of fandom. The fic does move quite slowly, very slowly in parts. Particularly, there is an entire chapter of Rainbow Dash evaluating her own thoughts in order to determine that she really is attracted to Twilight Sparkle. And I suppose you could, therefore, make the case which you have, which is that the fic itself is almost defending the choices that it's making as it makes them to try and be more resilient to arguments. It's the meta that we're missing from the start, that we bemoan the lack of, becomes a different kind of meta, wherein the story is trying to justify itself as it's telling itself.
Yeah, it felt to me like the author had realised partway through that the prompt was about meta and that they were going to undercut that completely by doing exactly what the meta had said was possibly a bad thing. And the opening statement of the fic, the prompt was about how opposites attract can't really work in reality. And the rest of the fic then goes on to say, well, yes, it can, and here's how. And it was almost like partway through they thought, I've kind of wandered off topic, and now I feel defensive about this.
And I think it is very telling that, looking at the little story within the story and the commentary on that, the only argument Dash really has is, and I quote, daring has to be meant for Roberta. She just has to be.
I think that's the line that the whole fic was meant to hang on. It feels like that is what we're supposed to take from this. It just has to be a sort of a denial that has nothing to back it up. And if we've talked about nothing and during this particular little review, it's that fanon and fandom can draw a lot from nothing. But it's a kind of a backward question in that sometimes you don't need to justify a thing. The thing justifies itself by its own existence. And I feel that this fic has done a disservice by the fact that the authors felt a need to try and justify the choices that they're making. Whereas I think it would have been a better, shorter, still fluffy fic if the author just presented the thing that they'd wanted to and then just let that be itself.
I agree with you 100% on that, yeah.
Yep, so do I.
I agree.
Yeah, I guess I agree.
I think that's a good point to leave it. Anyone want to add anything before we go?
My final thoughts personally, this fic, it was too cliche, it was terrible. No offense to the author, but no, it was terrible.
This is just my personal opinion. I don't think shipping should ever be like the backbone of a story. I have never once really, on my own initiative, read a story that was solely about the romance. I think when romance consumes the whole story, it just kind of doesn't work for me.
I would disagree with you there entirely. I think it just doesn't work in this particular case. I think there is a place for sort of romance and shipping in literature, and hey, if it's not your cup of tea, don't read it.
Well, again, this is coming from someone who, as a rule, doesn't read romance, so...
I think shipping has its place. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it has its place. It's just that shipping is, always has been, always will be, the biggest chunk of fan fiction. And what's that? Is it Sturgeon's Law? 10% of everything is good and the 90% is crap.
That's Sturgeon's Law, indeed.
So I think that's just the case with this, that if you don't like shipping, you're probably not going to like 90% of shipping especially.
Okay, and I think that is the end of our Heroic Review. You've been listening to the Heroic Review. I've been your moderator, Deadlyreg. Joining me was BrainedbySaucepans.
Toodaloo, folks.
Greg.
Long days and pleasant nights, listeners.
Cider Barrel.
Farewell.
Scribbler.
Be lovely to each other and good night, everybody.
And we'd like to apologise for the disappearance of our contributor Goombasa during this recording. Due to problems with his internet connection, his connection dropped out during the review and didn't come back. So once again, we'd like to apologise to our listeners for the lack of his voice and to Goombasa for his inability to continue to participate. Once again, I was your moderator and thank you for listening.